Unitarian for Universalist Social Justice Democracy Leaders Gathering, hosted by the UUSJ Democracy Action Team. My name is Pat Marr. I'm on the UUSJ board and the Democracy Action Team. I just want to give you a little bit of information as you're coming in this evening and getting settled. Our guest speaker will be Zachary Mueller. He is a political strategist and expert in tracking strategic racism. He will speak on the topic, how did authoritarianism enter the mainstream? We'll also talk about our UUSJ guide to the recent passing of the Action for Immediate Witness. And this guide demonstrates what your democracy team can and should be doing, as well as some actions that we can all take. I'm really looking forward to working with you and hearing your thoughts tonight. We'll have some time for a Q&A a little bit later. But right now, I would like to invite you to put in the chat your information, because we want to get to know you a bit better. Could you tell us your name, your congregation, and how you're feeling tonight? How's it going for you tonight? And pardon me while I gather something for the chat. And I just want to remind you to please mute yourself and have your video on as you like. If you want to have it on, and if you don't, that's fine too. We're good with whatever you're good with. There we go. And if you have some questions or comments after this meeting and you want to contact me, I'm at pat@uusj.org, as you can see in my my name on my screen name right there. Right. Our UUSJ democracy movement efforts aim to create a society where everyone's basic needs are met and people have the opportunity to grow and thrive. Our goal is to create a democracy that prioritizes the needs of the people and dismantles systems that prioritize the rich and powerful. UUSJ's mission is to advance equitable national policies and actions aligned with UU values through engagement, education, and advocacy. And right now I have just a simple kind of candle here that I want to use to light our chalice, open with some words. We come together as seekers and companions from the power of our memory and history, with high hopes for the days that lie ahead. May we dream and design a bold future together, grounded in the wisdom of every voice among us and in the ever-present power of love. Thank you for joining us this evening. And now I'm handing the mic to Pablo.
Thank you, folks. I'm glad to be here with you this evening. My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. And this evening's Democracy Leaders event is co-sponsored by our Immigration Action Team, because the nature of what Zach is going to speak to us about really brings those two portfolios together. And I feel that his content for us this evening is rather important for all UUs to understand. So for that reason, I'm going to invite Terry Brogan to take the spotlight and just give us a brief announcement and sort of situational awareness about UUSJ's Immigration Action Team and their work.
Okay, so should I go ahead? I guess so. I see Pablo on the screen, but I'm gonna go ahead and start. So thanks, Pablo, and thanks to the Democracy Team. I don't know if people can see me or not, but I can see myself anyway. Thanks to the Democracy Team for sponsoring tonight's event. As Pablo suggested, protecting democracy and standing up for the rights of migrants have been priorities for UUSJ. There I am throughout our organizational history. And the importance of these two issues was reinforced, as many of you know, in the last UU General Assembly, where the two actions of immediate witness from our two teams were overwhelmingly adopted by percentages of 98 and 99%. The immigration action of immediate witness reasserts past UUA support for the rights of immigrants and refugees. And also, I think this should be of interest to folks, provides a robust menu of actions that individual UUs and our congregations can take. We encourage all of you to take a look at it for ideas. During the course of my remarks, my co-chair, Steve Ekstrom, is going to be adding some things to the link, for example, starting with a link to the action of immediate witness. So I encourage you to look at that now if you can. It will be available in materials provided later. As our speaker will no doubt address in compelling ways, the current administration has supercharged efforts to demonize immigrants, unfairly make them scapegoats, they've rounded up and disappeared thousands of our neighbors, and they've decimated literally much of the infrastructure and funding to help people trying to become Americans and build productive lives. This is not the America that we want or expect. So we invite you to join the UUSJ immigration team in opposing those trends and also advocating positive alternatives. Let me just briefly cover some of the work we do so you get a sense of what we do. We issue action alerts, allowing UUs and friends to easily send messages to their members of Congress. We've issued a number in the last 6 months that unfortunately are all still very relevant because these issues continue to be relevant. And you can find all of the action alerts, not just from our team, but from all the UUSJ efforts on the UUSJ homepage, which should be available on the chat. I want to highlight 3 recent action alerts very quickly. One talks about our support for legislative efforts to finally honor commitments Americans made to local allies in the Afghan war who risked their lives to support our troops and their hopes for a better country. A recent action alert asked members of Congress to support Dreamers by both passing legislative resolution of their status finally, the Dream and Promise Act, and by contacting the Department of Homeland Security and telling them to stop detaining DACA recipients. You can find that link as well. And our most recent action alert, just up in the last few days, addresses the need for Congress to fully restore the refugee resettlement program. And again, that link should be up on the chat. A second bucket of activity that we conduct is we organize meetings between local UUs and their members of Congress to promote legislation we support and oppose proposals that we find offensive. This year, we focused on engaging dozens of UU congregations in congressional districts across the country, which we targeted because of their political importance. This led to a series of online meetings to express opposition to the budget proposal that was very active at that time, which funded mass detention and deportation in amazing ways in terms of the sheer amount of money, and also defunded, as I'm sure you know, desperately needed healthcare and other programs. A third type of activity that we conduct is sharing information on the latest developments and opportunities to work with our allied organizations to promote positive outcomes for migrants. So I'm going to end by sharing 2 ways that you can get in contact with us and learn more about our work. If you'd like to be added to an email list to learn about upcoming actions, you can respond to the address that's listed is the next to the last link in the chat. And the very last link in the chat, finally, is if you're interested in getting more directly involved in the actual planning and implementation of our teamwork, you can also contact the team at that chat, that link as well. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you'll join us in this work.
Thank you so much, Terry. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Zachary Mueller. I need to tell the group my computer's behaving a little slowly, so I'm gonna have to be a little extemporaneous with his bio. But I think you've seen in the emails, Zach is the former senior research director at America's Voice. And in that capacity and in much of the other work that he's done as a political strategist and a campaign operator, I want everybody to know he has credits. He makes comments for the Washington Post, for MSNBC, for the New York Times. But more importantly, Zach is one of those people whose name precedes him in advocacy work, and especially in the conversation around democracy and immigration. So while his name may not be well known and famous to you, I was deeply honored to catch his comments in a sort of private forum previously, and I just was so delighted when he accepted our invitation to come speak to our UU community. I do think his ideas are really important for UUs to understand. They're so important, you're going to go, aha, of course. But he's going to break down for you what you're actually seeing and what you're living through. So with that, I give us Zach. Thank you so much, Zach.
Well, thanks, Pablo, for having me here tonight and for those kind words. Your check's in the mail for all the kind words that you said. So, no, just kidding. But I'm really happy to be here tonight. Thank you all for signing on this evening. I know there is lots for competing interests and attention. So I appreciate you all taking the time to engage in what is, I believe, a very serious and an important topic. So I brought a couple slides with me here tonight, and I will just kind of stay at the top here that I do tend to talk a little bit fast, but the slides will be available to you along with the recording. So in case I kind of move through a little bit quicker, you can always go back later, and then we'll have a little bit of robust question and answer at the end as well. I'm going to kind of go through the presentation. So if you have a question that's kind of burning throughout, feel free to write it down. Feel free to throw it in the chat. I'll come back to that as soon as I'm kind of done with the presentation. But today, I really want to explore how the political debate around immigration has become a focal point in the fight for American democracy. And I really want to assert that an admittedly provocative challenge that a powerful authoritarian movement has weaponized nativism to advance anti-democratic ideas from the margins to the mainstream, and how we must engage on the issue of immigration if we are to defend against a complete erosion of American democracy. Today, I really want to offer a broad set of frameworks for understanding the threat we're up against, rather than the kind of nitty-gritty details of the authoritarian movement on the rise in the United States. So with that, I really want to begin by really widening our aperture. I want to think about a way to read American history as a tug of war between movements of American democracy and movements of American authoritarianism. Movements pushing and pulling in either direction. We can think about like the Revolutionary War to cast off a king, followed by a constitution that cast our fellow Americans as 3/5 of a person. Or we can think about this push and pull of a tug of war from the Reconstruction amendments after the Civil War to the redemption movements that established Jim Crow. Or more recently, the major movements of democracy in the form of the civil rights movements, from which an authoritarian movement we face today really began to build in that wake. And today, a 21st century American authoritarian movement is dangerously close to pulling down the forces of American democracy. Democracy and authoritarianism, they're big ideas, and they can feel really abstract. And they shape the entirety of the organization of our daily lives. They're really big and abstract ideas, but they have a really material effect about how we interact in the world around us. But nevertheless, we really lack, I think, a shared, comprehensible, understandable definitions of these really core set of ideas. And so while some might quibble with how I'm defining both of these concepts here today, really I'm trying to root out to like the deep core of these concepts. And I think it's helpful for us to think about each one, both democracy and authoritarianism, each as a system that determines how decisions are made amongst a group of people. Now, authoritarian movements argue that only a select few should be responsible for making decisions, concentrating power, profit, and security. It's a trade-off of responsibility. Less freedom for less responsibility. And, faced with a really chaotic world, it isn't that hard hard for us to understand the appeal of letting someone else take hold of the wheel. Now, democracy movements argue for the totality of people should be able to meaningfully participate in the decisions that govern their daily lives. A democracy strives to guarantee that participation through the right to be heard, responded to, and to organize to improve the conditions of our community. It's again a trade-off of responsibility. More freedom, but also more responsibility. Now, I think we can kind of find clarity through contrast. So I want to kind of put democracy up against authoritarianism to kind of better understand both ideas by how they contrast with one another. And these two systems are kind of pulling in opposite directions. And we can find that clarity through contrast in a couple of different ideas. I think around the notion of power. So we can think about authoritarianism as a concentration of power and democracy as really an expansion, distribution of that power. Or we can think about it in concepts of citizenship. Authoritarians seek to reduce the citizenship, both by restricting who has access to it and the extent of its value. We should see this not just as it relates to immigrants, but when citizens get less say over the decisions that affect their lives, less in government benefits, more armed government agents in the streets, the value of citizenship is reduced. Meanwhile, democracy movements call for an expanding of citizenship, meaning expanding the accessibility of all the people covered under the governing purview, as well as expanding the value and the terms of that participation and benefit. I think here we can understand that locking millions of people out of being able to access citizenship has always been and remains a constant threat for democracy itself here in the United States. So today's ascendant forces are a tug of rope towards American authoritarianism. And they're what I call a new nationalist movement. So we're going to kind of start to break down this kind of new authoritarian movement. I really think it's important for us to think about this as a new version of nationalism that is breaking through inside the mainstream of our political situation. So this is what I call neo-nationalism. Neo as being the prefix for new, just is a way to take the two words of new nationalist and smash it into one. And I think it really describes a vast covering of several different tendencies, but are generally a shared goal of redefining who is an American. So I use this term, right, because we think we have a lot of terms that get thrown around that some of you on this call might be familiar with between white nationalism and Christian nationalism, nativist populism, techno-nationalism, traditionalism, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different ideas and words and tendencies. And these things mean different things, and there's different disagreements in their movement. But how do we start to describe the big movement that we are confronted? And I think this term of neo-nationalism, new nationalism, is a way to be able to talk about this, really captured in the slogan of America for Americans. Really arguing that the central problem facing the nation today is that there are too many unreal Americans in America, threatening the well-being of quote-unquote real Americans. But let's deconstruct this story of the neo-nationalists organized around a little bit more to better understand what I'm talking about. So what is the story that they tell that provides the lens of which this movement interprets the events around them? So I'm lifting a large part of this analysis from elsewhere, but I can call this argument the middle squeeze. So the middle squeeze interprets the world, a set of events, news, other things that are happening around them and in the world through a conspiratorial angle, seeing a cabal of elites stealing from deserving the real middle to give handouts to those at the bottom in a trade for keeping those elites in power, really squeezing the middle from above and below. Now, it's important to note here really that elites can be as much as an aesthetic or cultural determination as much as one is a position of power, right? You can think about this as this authoritarian movement may deem a adjunct professor at a local community college who's teaching one feminist course as an elite, right? That teacher may not have much power and privilege in society, but we can think about elites of how that this argument determines elite is pretty expansive. So this structure, this like structural framework has guided this authoritarian movement for decades. The movement we're seeing today, this kind of middle squeeze is kind of charted through a period of time about how they're thinking about the world around them. And I think you look closely and you'll start to see this structure of the middle squeeze story everywhere. Immigrants now have become the primary villain of the neo-nationalist organizing story, but they are far from the only villain in this story. One of the sharpest and most deadly examples of the middle squeeze argument is this so-called Great Replacement theory, where globalist elites are importing immigrants to replace real Americans. It's a version of this kind of middle squeeze argument that some folks here may unfortunately be familiar with. So when we are examining the organizing story of this middle squeeze, we can see the results in two important ways around authoritarian conclusions. So we can start to see how a nationalist movement might move to these authoritarian ends because the conclusions of which that they view the world lead them to those authoritarian arguments. So conclusion one is that the government needs to be granted extraordinary powers to be able to track down and purge all of the un-Americans in elite positions and the mass of un-Americans at the bottom in order to protect the real American people. Conclusion two is that democracy is vulnerable as a system, and it should not be trusted because un-Americans pollute the system, delivering the wrong results in elections. In major crackdowns on democratic processes like voting, protests, free speech are necessary in order to protect that version of democracy for real Americans. We can see how these conclusions kind of lead you to an authoritarian idea about that's the kind of system we actually need. But the middle squeeze argument was not born yesterday. The kind of nationalist authoritarian movements that have been employing it for over a century as they have struggled to pull America towards authoritarianism in that ongoing tug of war. So I pull this from historian Linda Gordon, who describes the popular movement that was the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan that was organized a century ago now, but has strikingly similar terms to the middle squeeze argument. And I pulled out the proper noun here. You kind of see a red line where she in her book that I outlined here talks about the Klan. But I pulled out the Klan to be able to look at this statement to think about how it sharply describes the authoritarian movement we face today. Again, I'm not going to go read through this full quote. I'll send the slide deck afterwards if you want to kind of dig into it. But I want to keep moving on here. Because locating the origins of this movement and its ideas is helpful, I think, for three important reasons. First, it is to further clarify the ideas of an effective authoritarian movement that we seek today. Because effective authoritarian movements, well, they try to obscure their ideas. And I think if we look at kind of the historical origins where stuff is very similar, we can kind of see the root of those ideas. And this leads to the second reason why I think it's important, is we can see the root of those conditions that we face today. We can see them as less as unique aberrations in the history of the United States, and we're able to draw more comparative lessons for the practical contextual realities of dealing with American authoritarianism. So we can see the lessons of the past and see similar type movements, similar type organizing, similar type theories, and how do we think about how groups of Americans overcame that threat in the past to learn lessons from today. That's the third line, is learning those lessons. So we can look at the two dual nationalist authoritarian movements really in this period from a century ago, in the second wave of the KKK, as well as the eugenics movement, to locate the origins of the ideas animating the authoritarian movement that we face and are confronted with today. So Gordon, the historian I provided earlier, provides a really good summary of the second wave of the Klan. But the eugenics movement used quack race science to advance the same conspiratorial fears of that middle squeeze, the same version as the Klan did. Now, they argued that real Americans, white Americans, were facing an existential threat from immigrants, blacks, and social deviants. Like Madison Grant, who's pictured here, was a major figure in the eugenics movement and provides the base of that great replacement theory that I mentioned earlier that we are faced today in his best-selling book from 1916, The Passing of the Great Race. As an aside, one Adolf Hitler read this book while he was in jail in Germany and wrote a fan letter to Madison Grant in the United States, calling that book his, quote, Bible. But we can also see Grant's protege, Lothrop Stoddard, who foreshadows today's rhetoric as well. America, Stoddard warned, was being, quote, invaded by hordes of immigrants in his popular book titled The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which had sold over 1 million copies in the mid-1930s. So we can really kind of see this invasion rhetoric showing up well over a century ago to start to talk about immigrants coming to the United States. Now, at the time, the twin power of these movements, the Klan and the eugenics movement, were instrumental in creating the political climate to put pressure to pass the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924. This was the racist immigration legislation that shaped the literal face of the nation for over half a century. So that power of authoritarian movements are able to dictate policies that really affect the larger part of the country. And really as a continuation of a note of the influence of Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, it was read favorably into the congressional record as justification for passing the Johnson-Reed Act. So it's an official part of the congressional record. So we can kind of really see how about the eugenics ideas really are informing our immigration policies at that turn of a century ago. And it would really take the rolling success of movements of American democracy decades later to roll back the successes of that movement of American authoritarianism and further expand who was permitted to become an American with the 1965 Hart-Celler Act. Now, and I would probably tell folks on this call, right, this is far from a perfect law, but we can really see the effects of contrasting movements reflected in major policy reforms, particularly around immigration. And while there are important differences in these movements from the past and those that we face now here a century later, we can really see a shared structure of an argument, of a rhetorical argument from a movement a century ago. Now, notably, the movement we confront today really sees the 1965 Act as a culmination of a bureaucratic revolution from which they must take their country back from. So this is the period of the new nationalist movement. This is the new part. So we can think about this before World War II. What makes it new is kind of after the defeat of Nazis, after the defeat of nationalist ideas in World War II. We kind of enter into this new period when they're in from the margins and they do this march through the mainstream. So this is a very, 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 very Cliff Note version of some of this movement that we're seeing. Really seeing in 1965 with the Immigration Act that they say, well, we've lost our country, we've got to take it back. We really see kind of a march to the mainstream around these ideas, really becoming popular in the mainstream in the 1990s, particularly around figures like Pat Buchanan. We see a large movement that these nationalist authoritarian forces bring in as new elements to their movement around the Tea Party, kind of go out and organize those folks into the streets. And then we see a bunch of strategic wins and victories by defeating different elements. So this is elected officials, but also we can see this in the 2007 defeat of the immigration bill then and an immigration bill in 2013. So we can, again, this is a very brief summary of this movement is kind of, again, moving from the margins of society, slowly making victories into the mainstream. So coming out of that history, I want to kind of update us to where we're at today. So how does this new nationalist movement particularly tell a nativist story about immigrants to advance undemocratic ideas into the mainstream today? So really echoing the rhetoric of the past, they claim that liberal elites or foreign governments are facilitating a literal invasion of the United States via immigration, excuse me, to replace real Americans in order to steal their country from them. Now, the invasion lie that is the authoritarian's focal point. It is an obvious lie that we are at war with a non-existent enemy in order to roll out an authoritarian agenda on the backs of immigrants. Now, there has been a years-long coordinated effort by this movement to normalize the invasion rhetoric. The invasion language is specific and intentional. It is not happenstance or mere hyperbole. The invasion lie, and this invasion word very specifically, is central to the new nationalist project, is essential to the authoritarian movements that we see today. Really, because the mainstreaming of this idea about an invasion, about deeming our immigrant neighbors an invading force, that mainstreaming effort has two specific goals in mind. Goal one is to trigger the authoritarian powers reserved for times of war outlined in the invasion clauses of existing legal code. So we can think about how in times of war, you might suspend normal democratic rights because you are dealing with a military threat. So engaging with the invasion rhetoric allows you to trigger those laws very specifically. And then goal two is to create a dehumanized enemy, an enemy that is subhuman, turning immigrants from neighbors into invaders to provide a villainous scapegoat to justify authoritarian actions. The lie that we are in the midst of an active war with our neighbors not only justifies the escalating cruelty targeting these quote unquote enemy combatant invaders, it also justifies the primary force of the nation's attention. Because if we, let's step back a bit and let's say that this lie was true, that there actually was an invading foreign army in the cities of in American cities. Well, then logically, it would make sense that all of our attention would go to that active war invasion and that we would actually want to send military troops to US cities to repel that invasion. We can look at a very clear example of Ukraine as seeing how an actual invasion, the logic of that plays out. But the importance of this rhetoric about thinking about the invasion lie very specifically as critical for thinking about this moment. And while this lie is not new, as we highlighted before, it has really marched into the mainstream by an authoritarian movement over the last several years. But what is new is that the White House is fully adopted the justification for the immigration agenda in its official executive orders, making the invasion lie a central feature of the mainstream immigration debate that we can no longer ignore. This isn't something that's happening on the sides. This is the official policy justification of the federal government. So really, I want to combine some of our frameworks here, thinking about the invasion lie and the middle squeeze argument as if it's the central story by this neo-nationalist movement for the popular justification for eroding American democracy. And how and why does that story work? Why is that something that's convincing to our neighbors? And now I think it works for a number of reasons, but I think what's really important for us here tonight is to think about because it agitates three core popular anxieties that really any successful popular movement would agitate around. It's targeting concerns of material stability, personal safety, and a sense of belonging and community. Now, as I said, authoritarian movements do not have exclusive access to agitating these anxieties, far from it. They are the real core shared concerns of varying degrees amongst working families in America today. I mean, I would ask you all to think about the last time that you worried about money, or that maybe I feel a little bit unsafe, or the community could be safer, or that like I want to belong to something larger than myself. I think for most Americans, we feel this to certain degrees quite often, that we all kind of have these kind of concerns from our day-to-day lives. And this authoritarian movement is agitating those anxieties and saying, well, here is the solution. The solution is to get rid of democracy, to purge and create mass deportation in order to alleviate those anxieties. We'll fix these problems. You will no longer have these concerns if you go with us. So it also works. This middle squeeze argument also works in the movement, the authoritarians that we're seeing today, because they get half the story right. They're half right. And like that's pretty convincing. If you're half true like that, well, I'm pretty convinced by the answer sometimes if half the things that you say I'm nodding along with. And I think there are two things that they're particularly this authoritarian movement is getting correct that I think we need to rightly acknowledge. One is that they are right that American families are struggling. It's hard out here. And folks are really struggling to make ends meet or really worried that they are one crisis away, one cancer dose diagnosis away, one car accident away from real economic ruin. And there's real fear that people have of our neighbors. And the second thing they get right is that democracy, American democracy, has been malfunctioning. It's not working for working people. There is a lot of problems that working folks face, and our government is not actively solving them in real ways. There is all of this bickering and partisanship that exists where real problems are not being addressed, and the system that is working, folks are not feeling like it's affecting their real lives. And this authoritarian movement is naming both of these things, and their answer is to, well, let's throw out democracy. It's inefficient. We should have just a few people to make all the decisions to answer that problem. And I think we need to understand that they're naming some of those really core concerns and offering that as a solution. But I really want to introduce this other concept because I think it's helpful for us to think about in this moment as we talk about the move towards American authoritarianism. So I think this idea from Stephen Volinsky and Lucan Way's concept of competitive authoritarianism is really helpful for understanding this threat. Because I think too often we collapse the idea of authoritarianism into this kind of cartoonized version that is sharply defined lines of clear, ambiguous consistency. We are not looking for, bam, now it's authoritarianism. It's a clear line, yes or other. But really, we're seeing one thing building on another, really throughout the subtlety of daily life. That it isn't a question about whether we're in authoritarianism or not, but we're seeing all of these different authoritarian elements from this authoritarian movement build, so that we look back a decade from now and said, whoa, what happened to our democracy? And I think it's not really the hard, undeniable reality of banning all voting. So I think this idea that Levitsky and Way put forward, that competition is real but unfair, is a way for us to really think about how American authoritarianism is starting to show up in our day-to-day lives. And now that can look like a mid-decade partisan racial gerrymandering. That could look like forcing in-person voting while stationing immigration checkpoints around the polls. Or it could be cutting voting rolls or cracking down on protests or prosecuting political opponents. This can show up in all these little different ways that kind of build over time towards authoritarianism. Now, at the same time, the middle squeeze invasion lie that the authoritarian movement offers structurally is a scam. It's a convincing one to be sure, but it's a scam nonetheless. Meaning that those who are convinced by this scam are not stupid, they're not naive, but like most everybody from time to time, find themselves confused, looking for answers to complex problems. And I think many of us probably on this call have fallen for a scam once or twice before because we're looking for an easy answer to a complex problem, and that's relatable. But we want to be able to identify what this scam is. And I like to call this scam the perpetual villain problem. So really, it is that authoritarians justify their power by promising to purge the villain lurking just around the corner. Give me the power because I've got to go hunt down all of the villains. And then the purges means cutting programs, restricting rights and freedoms to punish the villains. Well, we've got to cut Medicaid programs because we have to cut all of the quote unquote illegal immigrants off the Medicaid programs. But meanwhile, we're just cutting Medicare for everybody. Well, we have to have a curfew because we've got to go after the villains that are and the criminals that are in the streets. That's why we got to send the National Guard to your city because we're going to purge these villains. But without the villain, the authoritarian nationalist is no longer necessary. If there's no villain, then why give up our rights and freedoms? Why give over to the authoritarians all of our power, our rights, and freedoms if the villain doesn't exist? So what's important about this is that though it's authoritarian movement promises positive construction, that they're going to benefit the real Americans in the middle, we'll never actually get to that part. We'll never ever get to the benefits part because they're always going to be hunting these villains down. They always need a villain to exist. So how might this be pertinent to our day-to-day work? I argue, as I did here today, that the new nationalist movement is effectively weaponizing the politics of immigration to pull towards American authoritarianism. And to stop it, we need to engage the issue of immigration and that it pulls in the opposite direction of democracy. As a publication from the US War Department warned frontline soldiers in March of 1945, the only way to prevent fascism from taking hold inside the United States was to ensure that our democracy worked. And worked here doesn't mean just do we have access to the ballot box, but that actually does the system deliver for the concerns that are facing working people? Are wages going up? Are worker rights protected? Do we have access to education and affordable health care? Right? Does democracy actually work for working people? So to meet this moment and confront the enemies of democracy, we need a bigger framework on immigration that really elevates the debate on the issue to a question of democracy versus authoritarianism. The choice is between a system of expanding or restricting citizenship, a system that working people can have to meaningfully participate in the decisions that govern their lives, or ones that hands over responsibility to a few who will dictate who counts as a real American and what policy they think is best for them. But unfortunately, I do not have a magic set of words that you can cast that will just fix our problem. Unfortunately, life is not that simple. But there are three messaging pivots that I want to think about that can be helpful in entering this debate from a larger narrative framework around democracy and authoritarianism when we think about the issue of immigration. And so, because I didn't want to leave you with a dark path of here's what we're up against, close the books and say you're on your own, trying to think about the ways in which that we engage this to pull towards American democracy, pull towards a more inclusive democracy that includes our immigrant neighbors. So the first is really pulling out this example of the invasion line. I name this as a very specific part of their strategy, but it's also an absurd one, right? To claim that our immigrant neighbors aren't in like a secret invading force that we go to church with, we go to work with, that we see walking down the block. Most Americans know that the idea that they are an invading force is absurd. And so I think we want to name that. We want to name and we want to undermine the credibility of authoritarian movements by saying that they're lying to us about a imaginary war in order to steal our rights and freedoms away from us. And that these are our neighbors, they are not invaders. So what I think isn't really is more of a tension point here I really want to name that is like new, a bit new in this moment, is that part of authoritarian movements, the success that they have is dehumanizing a group of people, particularly here in our case around immigrants, making them less than human. And part of the work that we want to think about in doing good work around the immigrant community in these issues and around democracy work is to humanize those folks. We want to create the idea that our immigrant neighbors are hard workers, they're law abiding, they're amongst our community. And that moral suasion, if you will, that humanization, that's really important. And we can't give that up. But we really need to be able to tie that into a larger strategy that starts to talk about it's not just that our immigrants are good people, but that the demonizing of them is a way to steal our rights and freedoms, is the way to steal our democracy from us. We need to have those things in concert to one another. So the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is like the second piece here is really what I call like expanding citizenship. And so for a long time, folks that may be familiar with the immigration issue, for decades, we've been calling for a pathway to citizenship for our friends, family, and neighbors who've been locked out of the system, who have unable to access citizenship in the United States. But I think it's important for us to start to marry these ideas a bit more, that a pathway to citizenship is for all of us. It's not just for our immigrant neighbors. Because what we want is a citizenship for immigrant neighbors that doesn't come along with low wages, no health care, unaffordable education, all of the other pieces that we know we need to fix in a more robust democracy. So how do we talk about the things that we want as a community, the things that we need as a robust citizenry? How do we demand more and have an imagination about what our democracy could be? That includes our immigrant neighbors as part of that citizenship conversation. The last piece here is I think about like a pro-worker approach. Often what authoritarians do, they do a divide and conquer strategy. And this is what a lot of folks do, right? Is that they divide people, working people, into arbitrary groups. And the idea that foreign-born workers and US-born workers, they're in competition with one another. And I think it's important for us to name that that division is artificial. It is what the nationalists are doing to advance authoritarianism. But we also need to lean in to say, actually, what we do need is we need real worker reform. We need real protection for working people. And working here, I don't mean just by the practice of going to work, but whether you are unemployed, underworked, retired, haven't entered the workforce yet, the large version of kind of working as position of power. How do we think about protecting working class people's rights as a function of also protecting immigrants' rights? Those things are actually two sides of the same coin. And we need to think about that and to make sure that when we're talking about immigrants in the form of the economy and working people, we're making that very clear and very central, that we're not otherizing immigrants as just economic dollars and cents, but they are a part of the function of a thriving economy that works for working people and the rights are protected. So I'm going to stop there. I went through a lot. I probably went a little bit over my time here, but I'm going to stop my screen sharing here now. But this is my email and my actual phone number, so feel free to hit me up. I know I look young, but I don't mind a phone call. You don't have to text me first, so feel free to always give me a call. You can even leave me a voicemail. I swear I'll actually listen to it. So I'll stop there. I'm gonna turn on my light here so I don't go in complete darkness as the night comes on us.
Thank you so much, Zach. Again, I think those in the UUSJ community who know me know that I'm a history buff, and they can probably see exactly why I found your body of work, your theory of the case so compelling. So with that in mind, I want to ask a question while people sort of gather their thoughts and do a little bit of processing before they put some questions in the chat. It occurs to me after seeing, your presentation previously and now again, is the authoritarian impulse the legacy of the transition from the predominance of monarchy as a form of government? Because so much of what you put your finger on in the why is authoritarianism compelling feels like they are the deep roots of a monarchistic approach to governance. And I feel like whenever I'm reviewing the history around our democracy, the emergence of democracies globally, so much of what you're putting your finger on feels like it's creeping up in that transition period into the early modern era, as we're moving away from monarchy as the predominant form of government. Do you have any thoughts on that while I school some questions from the chat?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about this concept and kind of this analogy around the tug of war of American history to kind of think about that the tension has existed all throughout American history between democracy and authoritarianism. And sometimes, as folks might remember, from PE class, when you did the tug of war, before any side wins, right, there's kind of this push and pull by the piece in the middle. And so in a democracy is what I believe in, that we're not in a democracy, you never really want 100% consensus, right? You're looking for 50% plus one, right? You're trying to think about allowing other ideas to flourish. And these ideas of authoritarianism continue to flourish. And I think the comparison to like a monarchy or some of that is very similar, right? There is this tendency that we have as a people that says, well, like, wouldn't it be nice if somebody else made all the decisions? I mean, I know, like, just to kind of be a little abstract here, has anybody ever felt at one time at night, you said, well, what are we doing for dinner? And you just really didn't want to make the choice anymore. You just really wish somebody else would pick dinner out and tell you, like, okay, like, I don't want to do the mental work picking out dinner, right? That's a very practical, real example. I'm not saying that that's authoritarianism, right? But we can see the appeal of having other people make decisions sometimes. And I think what's important for us to think about is that that tendency has existed for a long time, right? And so there is this trend from our history, from global history, from American history, that what we are facing is not an entirely aberration. That there are elements of these pieces, but it kind of evolves. And I think actually what I didn't mention here, but I think might be helpful, is to think about what's new in this moment. So if we want to look back at the example I talked about eugenics and the Klan, they were really explicit with the kind of racism and hostility to democracy. They would just name it, right? Like they were out front. They're like, we believe in white supremacy and we're not really sure about this democracy thing. Today, authoritarian movements, because of movements of democracy, they kind of code those things, right? Nobody's explicitly, I mean, there's some on the movement that will, but like in the mainstream argument, are not saying, we believe in white supremacy and we want to get rid of democracy. Often what we hear is authoritarian arguments that are shrouded in this idea of democracy. Well, we actually got to mandate a documentary proof of citizenship because we actually want to protect the right to vote. This is about limiting access to who has access to the ballot box, but it's shrouded in an argument that says we're actually here to protect democracy. I think that's the bit that's new. So we're going to see this continuation from this idea that folks have through monarchy, through other elements of authoritarianism. Um, but it's also new and shifting in this moment. So that's a long divergent to your question.
Well, and it's a good segue. I mean, I hope that everybody on our call has been aware of the preponderance of, social media videos of younger adult males saying things like, yes, I'm a fascist. I want
Mhm.
to utilize the democratic process to achieve the government that will then move us into a fascist regime. So there is a real thing there, and it's not imaginary. But in thinking about the band of players that is being assembled in this uh, movement for neo-authoritarianism, one of the best questions in the chat was, could you please explain how tightly bound is the Confederation of Neo-Nationalists? I personally do not understand how tech bros on one hand feel akin to Christian nationalists on the other. Is there some sort of tacit understanding that's, and I would add here, operating between the two groups that unifies their interest of power sharing? Are they likely to turn on each other in
Yep.
the future, or what? Help us understand
Yeah.
such a
Yes. This is
strange.
a really good question. So this is why I've talked about it like as neo-nationalism, because what I think is important for our day-to-day work. Like, as you all can see from all the books behind me, my day-to-day life, kind of a dork about this. Like, I've been studying the right for a decade, right? I read all their books. I'm like, I'm in the weeds, you know? I understand the differences of these different fights. They're kind of like inter fights. But I think for most of us who are living our day-to-day lives, there's no need to dig that far into the weeds and look at some ugly stuff all the time. So I'm trying to provide like a framework and a structure of how we might think of where these different factions might align. And I think from my reading, is that they align on the nationalist piece. They align on how we want to define a new version of who is an American. Now, these different tendencies, from white nationalist to Christian nationalist to the techno nationalist, they disagree on that definition. The more hardcore white nationalists will say that, like, well, Jews don't get to be involved. Folks who don't have white skin are not real Americans. But there are other versions underneath this umbrella that have a different set of an argument. So you all are here, right, from different parts of the country, even part of this organization, whether that be your church, whether that be other like rallies or movements or other folks you engaged with. We got different disagreements on our team. I've said in every meeting I've ever been to in a coalition where we've got slightly different versions of how we think about strategy, tactics, organizational structures. We are like movements on for democracy. We disagree over a whole set of things about what we would prioritize, what issues we prioritize, how we think about organizing, all of those different elements. And the same thing is true for movements of authoritarianism. So, how do we think about a big movement structure that exists? Because these differences do matter. And what I would say is that at the moment, we can see that a lot of the differences are kind of being papered to the side. But the more that this authoritarian movement gains power, the more that those disagreements that they'll fight over it. And when they get closer and closer to more policy pieces and being able to implement those, we'll start to see a lot of divisions. We can see one very particularly around the H-1B visa fight at the beginning of the year between somebody like Elon Musk and Steve Bannon, who had a disagreement about their kind of nationalist ideas about how we would let in workers for a particular industry. It's the H-1B visa. So they do have disagreements and they do fight amongst each other, and they fight amongst each other all of the time. And I think really what we are seeing now is this new nationalist movement, this authoritarian movement, is the product of a fight that's happened on the American right over the last several years. Because there's been a disagreement. It's just this new the nationalist version of this has started to win out. Um, we could think about other times in American history, very more recently, where these nationalist ideas didn't have as much purchase in the mainstream. It's because these disagreements exist. And so it's a bit of this kind of like more complex version. But instead of getting us too lost in the weeds, I want us to think about kind of the big structure frameworks and how do we have that conversation as much as possible to understand the threat that we face and being able to engage on the issue of immigration so that we don't necessarily always need to get into the weeds with them. Where how do we have this big structure of the argument? And I want to kind of pull in this other question here that Margaret asked in the chat about thinking about Black men and Latinx people really are kind of drawn into this movement as well. And I think this is kind of like as a similarly important question that we're dealing with. And so in a similar way, whiteness, white supremacy, racism, it's a what folks will call a social construct for social control, meaning that it's not biological. It's not something inherently in our biology that determines racial categories. And after, and this is a long, more complicated history I don't need to go into in full, but I'm always happy to come back to talk about this in detail. This other piece of fascination of mine is the construction of race. But I think what we're seeing in this moment is a new evolution of this concept of whiteness. And we can think about whiteness in a very similar way to think about like a privileged social class. And what the authoritarians are offering people, what the middle squeeze argument is offering people is that you too could be a real American if you don our ideas. You could be a part of this group. And there's a real appeal to non-white individuals to join that movement to say, well, actually, you can be a real American. And there's the concept from W.E. Du Bois, who wrote Black Reconstruction, who thinks about this as a psychological and public wage. That if you are a privileged part of the privileged class, well, then you might be hired first, fired last. Like there, you get positive representation in the media, right? There's a real value to be part of like the real people, and this is what the nationalists offer to different sets of people that may not who are not white. Who they're saying that you actually could have access to this, particularly the mainstream version of this argument. And that's a real appeal that people have that they are offering to folks. It says, actually, you can get these psychological and public wages if you join our team. Last little bit of divergence here is what authoritarians really offer is a life without accountability. That you, if you are part of the privileged class, the privileged group of real Americans, well, then you can do whatever you want. And like you could, you know, grab them by their genitals, right? You could, do crimes and not face consequences, right? Like there is if you were a part of an authoritarian piece, right? Like we may not have that sense of desire and appeal necessarily, but we can see how that could be really appealing, particularly for a tech company that wants deregulation, who may think about this nationalist ideas and see a really appealing of adopting nationalist ideas to get to the authoritarian piece. And then we can see a part of this movement that comes because they believe that there is a real American people and that they're being replaced. And so these different elements of these movements kind of get converged under this larger structure of this idea, in which ways that they show up in different ways and have different appeals to different Americans. But what I was trying to do here today is to provide what is a similar baseline structure that we can start to see and identify to take something that is extremely complex and start to reduce it to a bit of understanding.
Well,
So as you see, I have long-winded answers to all questions. So
that's all right by me. I don't consider them long-winded. I consider them robust and thorough. I will say this, your last two comments make me think, I want to remind our audience, we had the privilege of having a session with Professor Hari Hahn last fall, and she talked about the volatility in our political system as a function of a social dialogue going on about what kind of America we actually want to live in, and the political contests that we're living through, and the flip-flopping between parties, and the vision for America as something that has happened in the past and eventually settles on one vision of of what the political future of the United States should be, and then that is the predominant vision for a long chunk of time. So the stakes for us right now are, we've got to stop the backsliding of our democracy if we don't want to be living under these conditions for at least the rest of my lifetime, if not longer. So with that, I want to say thank you to our guest. He was extremely generous with his time. Thank you so much, Zach. Please understand, we're going to send a copy of the recording and his presentation, as well as some of the links that you've seen in the chat. But some of us are going to stick around to sort of process as a group, and also to continue with the rest of the Democracy Leaders program. But join me in going, waving your fingers, and giving some blessings to Zach for sharing his time and his talent, his treasure, which is his brain. I'm sure he's got other ones, but definitely his brain. So thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you all having me here. And I'll leave on this little last note, just one little bit as you all process, because I present about a lot of dark stuff. This is my job, is to present about looking at what we're up against and threats. And so I did see a question here around like about Hungary, about Russia, about comparative authoritarianism. I think that's correct. I think there's a way to kind of think about that as something very similar. I also think there's a way to think about authoritarianism as Jim Crow, as about keeping a segment of the American people locked out of citizenship, locked out of our democracy. And I say that as a bit of hope, a bit of thinking forward, is that Americans like you on this call have repeatedly heeded the call to stand up to authoritarian efforts in harder times than this, and have organized, have built movements, have fought for a democracy, have fought for more inclusion, and we won. And we should hold that, and we should look at those memories, right? Because I think the more that we think about Russia and Hungary, currently, we don't have a happy ending to that story yet. But we can look here at the American heroes that did heroic work to overcome elements of authoritarianism. And we know that we can do that if we put in the work to do it. And I think, like, as difficult as these times are, as we kind of look in the daily deluge, we can buoy our confidence by knowing we've done this before, and we don't want to do this again, but we are tasked with doing that piece, because this is the thing that's in front of us for our lifetimes. It is the thing that we are asked to do, whether we wanted that responsibility or not. So I just leave it there. A bit of confidence, if nothing else, that we can actually succeed here. So again, thank you all for your time. Happy to connect. I'll send the slides around and some of the information as well. So take care. Have a good night, everybody.